my grubby little hands and all my goods and chattels, which would have been even more degrading than it has been already.
You can either have photographic copies on canvas, or you can have full-scale copies made in due course, whichever seems the most
question of afford it, of course, isn't it?
Of course.
Yeah.
Faced with the imminent return of the bailiffs, Sir Michael borrowed £200,000 from the bank and paid up. He's now selling family heirlooms to redeem the loan.
Even the photographic results on canvas are extremely good.
Yes, I know.
But they last, they last, 50 years.
Pictures are a very personal thing. They are of your family, so you can't replace them. It certainly scar me, yes. Makes me feel very bitter. It's like wounding an animal, take them away. Absolutely.
I can only apologize for getting both of us involved in this. I went in first, of course, to test the water for you, and came off as badly as you did. Anyway, pictures first, jewellery, furniture. What a mess.
If the names were to win their fraud case against Lloyd's, I think it is very difficult to see how Lloyd's could continue in its current society basis. It would be another catastrophe for the city.
Sally Noel, I'm representing thousands of victims of Lloyd's fraud. And I wonder, is it possible to speak to Mr. Blair or Mr. Prescott?
It's not possible, it never has been. We always had it.
Whatever the outcome of the fraud case, one thing remains certain. Lloyd's reputation, built up over 300 years, will never be the same again.
We've had enough. Enough is enough. And frankly, there'll be a very big uprising soon because we're fed up with people turning their back on this huge ongoing fraud.
Lloyd's does not accept there has been fraud. Fraud has never been proven in any of the reports, the independent reports carried out by the various authorities appointed to investigate these issues, and nor does it think fraud has taken place. And no doubt, as and when a fraud trial takes place at some stage in the future, that issue will be proven.
We will get justice if it's the last thing I do. If it's the last thing I do. And I'm prepared to die for the cause. I said 4 years ago at the AGM that over my very dead body you will get another penny from me, Lloyd's, and I mean that. If they should pursue me for this small amount even that I owe, I will go on a hunger strike, and I will do it publicly at Winston Churchill's feet. Yes. That's the place I will happily die, because he was a man that fought for freedom for the people of this country.
Two Nobel Prize winners devise a mathematical formula to take the risk out of playing the stock market.
When I saw the formula, and I know enough about it to know that this is the answer.
Do they keep it? Write a best-selling book? Or do they nearly bring down the global economy?
Horizon, pure science, sheer drama.
All of us are searching. For some, the search for a lost friend, missing relative, or a treasured possession is the most important thing in life.
In a two-part special live on BBC One, we're hoping we can change a few lives, but we can't do it without you.
The Search starts Wednesday, the 27th of October, live on BBC One. Let's make it happen.
In search of the raw experiences that fueled one of the century's finest authors, Michael Palin takes an epic journey following in the footsteps of Ernest Hemingway at 11 o'clock. First, a day never to be forgotten, BBC One continues its in-depth look at the major years.
In September 1992, John Major's Chancellor emerged from the shadows of the Treasury to announce the devaluation of the pound. It was the government's worst humiliation.
It looked economically incompetent. We had been in charge of the economy when this disaster had happened.
Watch out, excuse me. John Major was very tenacious. He stuck at this. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He backed himself into a corner. It was just a question of how many dead bodies there were going to be at the end of the drama.
He just couldn't face it. He couldn't actually come to the point of decision. We were hemorrhaging, we were losing reserves rapidly. We needed a decision.
The Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the leading members of the government were utterly out of control of events, and the market was going to devalue the pound, which it sure as hell did.
The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
And I wasn't at all certain either that I could or even that I should remain as Prime Minister.
Thank you very much indeed. I've only got one thing to say. It's nice to be back.
On the 10th of April 1992, John Major returned to Downing Street as Prime Minister after winning the general election for the Conservative Party, an election that many thought he was bound to lose. Even as he celebrated victory, John Major faced a daunting prospect. The economy was in a deep recession, and the Conservative Party, still suffering from the trauma of Mrs. Thatcher's brutal sacking, was on the verge of a collective nervous breakdown.
I found it extraordinary that so soon after winning that unexpected election victory, so many of our colleagues were prepared to go back to Westminster, ignore the people who had worked hard to put a Conservative government in office, ignore the policies we had contested that election on, and then start going down their own route, irrespective of the damage it was going to cause to the government of the day and to the Conservative Party generally.
I think the party in its heart was hoping at that general election, hoping to lose, hoping that that would, to use the fashionable expression, then draw a line under the fratricidal battles of the Thatcher years. And then, damn it, John Major went and won the election, and won it narrowly. And there's a part of the party that never actually forgave him, I think, for winning the election.
The party's bitter internal divisions went to the heart of the cabinet itself. John Major and Norman Lamont, the Chancellor, faced one of the worst recessions since the war. But the two men were not close, and an atmosphere of mistrust had built up between them.
Norman is a very complex man. He's much more emotional, much deeper than I think most people realize. He has great mood swings from... He can be very charming. There's great charm there. And also he can be very bitter when he is upset. He can get very low. He got very black moods.
What was particularly curious about his appointment of Norman Lamont is that he'd never rated Norman. Norman, whatever his other qualities, was about as voter or user unfriendly as it's possible for somebody at the top of politics to be. I think if at that stage he'd have shifted Norman, there would have doubtless been a fuss, but it might have been better in the long term for Norman, and it would certainly have been better in the long term for John and his administration.
John Major and Norman Lamont did not see eye to eye on the economy. The Prime Minister placed pegging the pound to the Deutschmark within the European exchange rate mechanism at the heart of the government's policy. 2 years before, he had triumphed over Margaret Thatcher and insisted that Britain join the ERM. It was his policy, and he championed it as the crucial weapon in the fight against inflation. At a time of recession, this caused much pain. In order to keep the pound at its agreed value, interest rates had to be kept high. Unemployment rose, businesses went bust, and many homeowners were trapped with mortgages they could not pay.
Here was someone who hadn't had strong beliefs or strong positions, but extraordinarily decided to bet completely and wholeheartedly on the exchange rate mechanism. And so we had an economic meltdown, an economic disaster. And John Major was very tenacious. He stuck at this. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He backed himself into a corner.
Norman Lamont at the Treasury was by now concerned about the policy and the pressure it was putting on the economy. He says he tried to discuss the idea of leaving the ERM and devaluing the pound at a secret meeting with the Prime Minister that summer.
I remember it because we went on talking pleasantries for about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. And then I said, well, Prime Minister, perhaps we could talk about the subject we've met to discuss. And he said, oh. And I said, well, we have come to discuss our membership of the exchange rate mechanism. And he said, oh, I don't want to discuss that. I thought we were meeting to discuss my speech next week. That's what I want to discuss. I was very angry at, I thought, the casual way in which the matter was just put to one side in favour of considering a speech next week.
I've no recollection of the Chancellor asking for a meeting and it not being granted. I do, in fact, recall that we did have a meeting to discuss this matter, a meeting that I called at the end of July. And we discussed then all the options. ERM was very difficult. We discussed all the options and we agreed, the Chancellor and I, his senior advisers and my senior advisers, that we should make no change of policy.
Whether or not the meeting did take place, from then on, the Chancellor accepted the policy.
We are absolutely committed to the ERM. That is our policy. It is at the centre of our policy, and I hope there is no room for any doubt about that at all, that the government is determined to maintain our position. I accepted it, therefore it was my responsibility, and I had decided in my mind that it was my duty to soldier on with the policy that the Cabinet and the Prime Minister had insisted on.
On the 29th of July, the Prime Minister hurried to dinner with journalists from the Sunday Times. His purpose was to brief them that there could be no change in policy, but he went much further.
We argued strongly that he had to devalue. He had to get the pound down to a more competitive level, which would help our exporters and allow him to cut interest rates at the same time. And he just wouldn't do it. He was as stubborn as he could be. He thumped the table at one stage and said, Andrew, there is no alternative.
I talked about my long-term objectives for sterling. I talked about my loathing of inflation. And I made the point that providing we could rip inflation out of the system, there was no reason, if we followed the right policies, there was no intrinsic reason why sterling shouldn't become stronger than the Deutschmark.
The conversation would be quite acrimonious, but he left in good terms. I shook hands with him and saw him out. And then I bounded back upstairs again and got into my... I said, did he say what I think he said? And they said, yep, he said that he wants sterling to take over as the benchmark currency of Europe. So I said, well, I think he's nuts, but it gives us a story for Sunday.
John Major's Chancellor, Norman Lamont, was horrified when he saw the newspaper report.
Frankly, I thought it was an absurd thing to say when the Deutschmark was all the time pushing up, the pound was pushing down. I thought he was living in cloud cuckoo land, and I was most upset that he had said this, because it certainly didn't correspond to what I believed was realistic, and I thought it damaged the government's credibility because it was such a stupid thing to say.
Sure enough, that August, the pound began its slide against the powerful Deutschmark. John Major desperately needed the German central bank, the Bundesbank, to cut their interest rates to save the pound. He wrote to Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, 3 times that summer, calling for action to make the Deutschmark go down.
The German government were talking about European Union and the spirit of European unity. And the Bundesbank were following policies that were absolutely damaging in almost every respect to the economies of all of Germany's partners across the European Union. The two things just didn't match up. They were inconsistent, and that point needed to be made to the German government.
But it was to no avail. Early in September, European finance ministers and central bankers met at Bath to discuss the crisis. John Major ordered Norman Lamont to put further pressure on the Germans to reduce their rates. The pound would not be devalued. In a tense meeting, the Chancellor asked the Germans to cut interest rates 4 times.
He put it to them very flatly across the table, rather like sort of cross-examining in counsel in a lawsuit. I have to put it to you. I want you to respond to this. And this was received with rather an icy feeling round the table, embarrassed silence from the other ministers and central bank governors, and sheer determination from the Germans. I thought that he could have been more flexible in his approach.
I think that's complete nonsense. I mean, this is something that is said, but I put the question. I'm sure I put it courteously to them, but I was speaking on behalf not just of Britain but of other countries. I'm not sure that I ever believed that the Germans would do what we wanted, but it was our last best option. We had explored absolutely everything else.
Despite the German refusal to help, on the 10th of September, John Major once more went out on a limb. This time in a speech he made in Glasgow. There would be no devaluation.
I was by then becoming extremely nervous, and I didn't want him to have any hostages to fortune out there. He was inevitably going to have some, because you were at the moment that always occurs in an exchange rate crisis, where if you blink, you cause the crisis. And if you don't blink, you'll have said things that afterwards are going to look pretty exposed. I did warn him he'd get egg all over his face, but his view, and it was probably right, he was going to get egg there anyway.
All my adult life, I've seen British governments driven off their virtuous...
I put it in very personal terms in that speech, which made the perceived defeat for me even more painful and far more obvious than it might otherwise have been.
The soft option, the devaluer's option, the inflationary option, in my judgment, that would be a betrayal of our future at this moment. And I tell you categorically, that is not the government's policy.
Events were making a dissembler of me. I could, of course, have said very little, but the danger of doing that would that people would have taken the message, they're not going to defend sterling, and I would have made the loss of value of sterling a self-fulfilling prophecy.
His normal good political antennae seemed to desert him, because any sensible politician would have said, this is now becoming so difficult that maybe we should understate our support for the pound without in any way serving to undermine it by our words. Sometimes strong words don't reassure markets, they make it worse for markets.
It's 7 o'clock on Wednesday, the 16th of September. The news headlines this morning. At the start of another anxious day for the pound, a new doubt has arisen over the attitude of the German central bank.
As dawn broke that Wednesday, Black Wednesday forever after, John Major was told the head of the German central bank had made remarks which everybody took as a call for sterling to be devalued. His comments triggered mass selling of the pound.
Watch out, excuse me.
Barclay on 19.20, selling 5 marks. Anyone show me just 5?
Sure enough, financial institutions, banks and speculators piled into the city foreign exchange markets that morning, selling the pound. At 8:30, the Chancellor rang the Prime Minister and asked permission to raise interest rates immediately to keep up the pound's value.
The Prime Minister at that point said that he didn't want to put up rates. He made a rather extraordinary remark. He said there were some good economic indicators appearing later in the day, which I thought was rather bizarre. But I accepted that we would intervene first.
Intervention meant spending billions buying pounds in an effort to support sterling, but it had no effect. The Prime Minister had moved his office to Admiralty House while number 10 was being refurbished. He was holding a meeting there with senior colleagues when the crisis began. He asked them to remain.
One of the reasons why Douglas, Michael Heseltine and myself stayed in the meeting during the day once the subject matter changed, because it meant that here were the senior members of the government, all of us with our hands dipped in the blood, and I don't mind that, because it was a very, very bad day.
I think Ken Clark and I were doctors at the bedside. We were required eventually to sign the death certificate. We didn't really feel we'd been involved greatly in the treatment of the patient up to that time.
Throughout the morning, messages kept coming in from my private office saying that the turmoil on the foreign exchange markets was continuing and that sterling was still in difficulties. So it was evident we had a very difficult day on our hands.
93.98. Bacon. 91.
At 10:30, Norman Lamont contacted the Prime Minister once more. He asked for a 2% rise in interest rates. This time, John Major said yes.
I remember watching it on the screen, and the pound didn't flicker, didn't move. It remained absolutely flat. I felt rather like an American surgeon in one of those hospital soap operas watching a patient's heart, and the patient was well and truly dead.
We were powerless in the face of events. I think I'd always believed theoretically in the power of markets, but I'd never seen such a dramatic illustration, felt such a dramatic illustration, that the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the leading members of the government were utterly out of control of events, and the market was going to devalue the pound.
The Prime Minister at Admiralty House was holding a meeting with backbench MPs, part of his normal schedule, as he waited to see the effect of the 2% rate rise. Meanwhile, Norman Lamont, watching events down the road at the Treasury, came to the conclusion that the game was up and the pound would have to leave the ERM immediately. Just after 11 o'clock, he says he tried in vain to contact the Prime Minister.
I was going to tell him that we would announce that we would suspend our membership. And I waited and waited, and there was no meeting, there was no reply. I couldn't understand what was happening.
Is the Chancellor so timid on an issue like this, when sterling is falling through the floor, that he isn't prepared to walk across the road and interrupt a meeting? I simply cannot believe that is the case. The fact of the matter is there was no request to me to see Norman between 11 o'clock and 12:45. There was no request to come to the phone and take a phone call from him.
At 12 o'clock, the Chancellor did walk over to Admiralty House from the Treasury to find out for himself what was going on. He felt that to delay leaving the ERM would cost the country billions.
When I arrived there, the Prime Minister was in a meeting with backbenchers. I've no idea what he was discussing, and I was rather shocked that we were kept waiting, because it seemed to me here was this enormous crisis going on, and he wouldn't come out.
It just beggars belief that if the Chancellor of the Exchequer, on a day like Wednesday, the 16th of September, wanted to see the Prime Minister, that anybody kept him at a distance. It just is inconceivable. If the Chancellor had wanted to see me and had said, this is important, I must see the Prime Minister immediately, it would have happened.
At 12:30, the backbenchers left Admiralty House. Their meeting had overrun by 15 minutes.
Eventually, he did come out. He was entirely relaxed, joking, slapping the backbenchers on the back. And we began our meeting with the Prime Minister not until 12:45. I was thoroughly bemused and very angry.
Norman Lamont came in, and he was pretty white-faced and edgy, as well he might have been. And he said it hasn't worked, by which he meant the intervention and the 2% interest rate rise. It hasn't worked, and they're still selling. And it was clear, therefore, that we had to take further action. The question was what it should be.
Before any decision about leaving the ERM could be made, the Prime Minister told the Chancellor that he had to consult his 3 colleagues who had returned to Admiralty House. The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd wanted to avoid a hasty exit. He said it would destroy the government's Europe policy. The Prime Minister agreed.
What I didn't want as Foreign Secretary was for us to kick over the table as we left it. Because then the chances of actually getting back into reasonable cooperation with countries whose cooperation we desperately needed would be nil.
Norman Lamont was horrified that other ministers should be consulted.
I was completely flabbergasted. They had nothing to do with the Treasury, and frankly, they didn't understand the issues at all. I rather came to the conclusion he just couldn't face it. He couldn't bring himself to make the decision, and more people had to be involved, and we had to spend more time, and the results were disastrous.
That is absolutely outrageous. The senior members of the cabinet who were there had been there in the morning, had a right to be involved. This involved a very important matter of future European policy as well. Moreover, I thought Norman was wrong about suspension, and so did all the rest of our colleagues. He didn't advance a credible case for suspension, he didn't do it then, and he didn't do it subsequently.
The Prime Minister now doubled the stakes and made a final desperate throw. Directly against the view of the Chancellor, he ordered a 3-point rise in interest rates to 15%. Norman Lamont left the meeting at 2 o'clock and returned to the Treasury. The announcement of the 3-point rise in interest rates was made at 2:15 in the afternoon.
Anyone want to buy a house?
As the Chancellor predicted, the rate rise had no effect. Selling of the pound continued.
And we were just paying holders of sterling large checks while they turned up at the Bank of England. We were hemorrhaging, we were losing reserves rapidly. We needed a decision, and he was able to concentrate on the detail, but he didn't seem able to concentrate on the big decision that had to be made.
But the decision could be put off no longer. The Chancellor and Governor of the Bank of England now returned to Admiralty House to tell the Prime Minister it was all over.
When we saw that our reserves were pretty well all gone before the end of the day, and it had not saved the situation, we realized, I can't remember what time it was, 4 or 5 in the afternoon, that there was really no alternative but to come out.
At 7:30 that evening, Norman Lamont announced the pound's suspension from the exchange rate mechanism.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism.
At the time, I was very dissatisfied with how it was handled, but there it is. I had to get on with it. I had to cope with the political storm the next day, but I didn't feel any emotion at all as I said it.
The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
I was detached from everything other than how we dealt with the problem immediately in front of us. But the price to be paid for that was that once the crisis was over, I often became very depressed, looking back at what had happened and wondering whether we might have dealt with it differently or how did it come about. And I think those depressions were a serious problem.
Britain's enforced exit from the exchange rate mechanism was a public humiliation for the government. In the immediate aftermath, currency speculators in the city celebrated a killing. They had made over £10 billion profit, betting on the fall of the pound. The Bank of England is estimated to have lost £4 billion, the equivalent of £70 for every man, woman and child in Britain. But above all, it was a political calamity. At a time of deep recession, millions had watched in horror as the government raised interest rates to levels which would have done untold harm to businesses, homeowners and the economy at large. For John Major, it was a turning point.
That evening, late at night, when I went back to my flat in Admiralty House to think about the events of the day, I sat there for some time considering what the future may be, and I wasn't at all certain either that I could or even that I should remain as Prime Minister. The case for me to resign, I thought, was fairly straightforward. I had been Chancellor when we had entered the exchange rate mechanism. I was Prime Minister when we were ejected from the exchange rate mechanism, and it was a political disaster. Was I, therefore, in a position to resurrect economic and European policy, or could it better be done by someone else?
While he was reflecting on his future, the Prime Minister was telephoned by his sister.
I told her that I thought it had been a disaster, explained what had happened, and said that I thought that I would probably resign. And she was very scornful at this. Very scornful. I'm not a politician, was broadly her view, and I don't understand how politics works. But if you think you've got something wrong and made a mess, then you'd better clear it up. Isn't that what people elected you for?
He was going through agonies of doubt and worry about it all. He felt a great sense of responsibility and kept wondering quite how to handle matters and respond to events. And I did my best to buoy him up and support him. The way to have ensured total catastrophe following on total catastrophe would have been for the Prime Minister to suddenly lose the confidence to continue.
For several weeks thereafter, I still wondered whether it had been the right thing to do, whether to stay or whether to go. And I was persuaded to stay. But I shall probably wonder to the end of my days whether that was the right decision.
In the aftermath of the disaster, attention also focused on the future of the Chancellor. Many party grandees felt that he should resign.
Are you going to resign?
It was the appalling Chancellor that he had, Norman Lamont, who was responsible for all of this. In previous instances, with Jim Callaghan, for example, with the crisis in '68, once the pound had devalued, he immediately resigned. And that's what our Chancellor should have done. And if he didn't resign, then Major should have sacked him. Absolutely clear.
The Prime Minister had actually passed me a note on Wednesday, September the 16th, saying that he was not considering resigning, and I should not consider resigning either. He had put that in writing to me. But as one person put it to me, all right, you resign. It then comes out that on the day the Prime Minister overruled you, both about interest rates and about suspending our membership of the ERM. Where on earth does that leave the Prime Minister? He will go in no time.
After the initial shock, the full impact of the disaster of Black Wednesday began to sink in.
We, certainly John Major, and I think all of us, were aware that what we were seeing was not something which could be shrugged aside. We were seeing the destruction of our economic policy and of our European policy, both. For weeks after that, the Prime Minister was deeply depressed, not panicking, but depressed.
Eventually he came out of it, but he probably rightly predicted that he was never going to have the same happy experience as Prime Minister again, which I think by and large he was enjoying being Prime Minister up to the day of Black Wednesday. Yet sometimes I used to worry about whether he actually ever really enjoyed it again after that.
For some time after Black Wednesday, rumours circulated in Westminster that the Prime Minister had been unable to cope during the crisis and had hidden in a lavatory when difficult decisions were needed. It was said that he became slightly unhinged thereafter. Newspapers and television picked up the story.
I was supposed to be sitting alone in Downing Street. I was supposed to have dyed my hair grey. Well, if I'm going to dye my hair, it's a pretty odd colour to have picked. And of course it was complete and utter nonsense. And I read these stories in the press and heard about them on television with growing astonishment and complete frustration. It seemed to be a continuing piece of unnecessary and purposeless malice.
There were people trying to shift the blame to John, personally, who I think were responsible for all those stories. The stories were frankly untrue, and as they appeared to come from inside the government, I think were quite deliberately malicious.
I don't know where these stories came from, and I have always told people, always, that they were completely untrue. My criticism of the Prime Minister was precisely the opposite, that he was far too leisurely and far too calm and wouldn't actually come to the point of decision.
But against a difficult background...
A week after Black Wednesday, in an emergency Commons debate, the Prime Minister went on the offensive.
And it was not, Madam Speaker, just industry that supported entry into the exchange rate mechanism. So did commerce. So did the city. So did most trade unions. So did the Trade Union Congress. So did the opposition parties in this House of Commons.
I thought the right thing to do would have been for the Prime Minister to go to the House of Commons at the first possible opportunity, make a fulsome apology, make a statement about what had gone wrong. I mean, I think if you can't admit that was a mistake, then you don't really love Britain very much and you don't understand the nature of British politics. It was clearly a mistake. It did a lot of damage to a lot of very decent people who were struggling to support themselves and their families. And the least we could have done at the time would have been to have said sorry.
I'm perfectly prepared to apologise for things that are utterly wrong, but I think it would have been rather false and self-serving to have apologised for something that I believed in, even though it had gone wrong, because I believed in it. And I think if you look at the lasting impact in terms of counter-inflationary policy of the exchange rate mechanism, it was pretty successful.
In the course of a few weeks, the one policy...
To the opposition leader, John Smith, the disaster of Black Wednesday was an open goal.
He is the devalued Prime Minister of a devalued government.
Barely 3 weeks after Black Wednesday, John Major faced the party at the annual conference in Brighton. The crisis had dealt a terrible blow to the Conservatives' reputation.
Would you comment on the state of the economy?
10 months earlier, John Major had been hailed by his party for his skill in negotiating the Maastricht Treaty on the future of the European Union and getting Britain key opt-outs. But now, many party activists had had enough of all things European.
1992 party conference was unlike any party conference I'd been to before or since. It was firstly within just a few months of winning a general election. Yet from the attitude, we might never have won it. We might even have lost it. There was no post-election feeling of euphoria, though everyone had thought we would lose. The issue was Europe, 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 Europe.
2 days into the conference, Norman Tebbit, the Thatcher loyalist and former party chairman, made a speech from the floor in which he lambasted John Major's European policies. It was a devastating attack.
And I hope, Prime Minister, that you will stand by your Chancellor. After all, it wasn't Norman Lamont's decision to enter the ERM.
I was astonished at Norman's speech. He, of all people, as a former party chairman, knew exactly what he was doing by making that speech in that manner at that time. It was immensely damaging. And he spoke in absolutely demonic mode. And it was a total parody of the policy that he knew we had.
Do you want to be citizens of a European Union? No!
I sat there and I thought to myself, you were party chairman. How would you have reacted if one of your predecessors as party chairman had come to the party conference and attacked your policy in this way, in this fashion, knowing as you do that you were misrepresenting it in the way that you were?
Well, I can't say whether anyone else would have thought that my speech was demonic. Those who were there at the party conference, the party faithful, clearly felt that it was a speech which was pitched at just the right level. I'm sorry I had to do it in the way that I did, but he didn't take any notice of me when I did it in private.
Lady Thatcher, newly ennobled, also used the opportunity to unleash a broadside against John Major's European policy. In an article in the European newspaper, written to coincide with her own triumphal entry to the conference, she accused John Major of damaging Britain's constitutional freedom by signing up to the Maastricht Treaty. It was, in the view of one commentator, a double-barreled gun shot blast at an already open wound.
This combination of an ex-Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and a former party chairman, Norman Tebbit, was of course lethal. It was quite unprecedented in modern-day politics. And it inflamed the debate and it carried it forward. It encouraged people to pitch in on either side of the debate. Their subsequent opposition to the government on European policy was absolutely relentless. It went on and on. It wasn't just a short-term opposition, it was continuous, right up to the next general election. And of course, divisions like this in any party have a very profound effect, and it had a very profound effect on us. We lost very heavily the 1997 election.
The Prime Minister's pain continued. Only 4 days after the party conference, the government announced the closure of 31 pits with the loss of 30,000 jobs. The news came like a bolt from the blue, led to massive protests, and further damaged the government's reputation.
We hadn't prepared anyone for it. I mean, no one knew what was coming. I mean, perhaps they knew inside government itself, but it was kept to such a kind of close-guarded secret that it exploded on the population with all the intensity of a sort of hand grenade. And we were inundated. I mean, the ERM, we had quite a lot of calls, but we were inundated with telephone calls.
It was pretty soon after Black Wednesday. The government were under attack, and here it seemed was another decision that was a blunder, that hadn't been properly prepared. Insofar as it was mishandled, I must accept as much of the blame as anybody else. We did it for the best of reasons, because we thought we're going to have a tremendous subsidy month after month going into the pits that's non-productive. If we make the decision that ultimately will have to be taken anyway, swiftly, then we could put that money into the renovation of those communities.
The government announced a review of pit closures and extra money for redundant miners to ease the pain. But the party seemed in trauma, reeling from crisis to crisis. Now the civil war over Europe reached fevered intensity. On this issue, John Major stuck resolutely to the middle ground, to the fury of the Eurosceptics.
He was undoubtedly someone who thought that you should approach every problem practically, and that the reasonable men and women sitting around a table would come to a view that they could share in common. And that may sound very appealing. It's just that every now and again you come to a crucial moment, a crux in the national destiny, when I think you have to say whether you're one thing or whether you're another.
I was not prepared to go whole hog, as it were, in an anti-European position, which was where they increasingly were. But I wasn't prepared to do that because I thought it was wrong in principle. I didn't like the flavour of it for the Conservative Party. It was too narrow a position for the Conservative Party. And I didn't think it was in the interests of the country. We had to keep options open.
That October at the Birmingham summit, John Major told European leaders that the Maastricht Treaty would be ratified in Parliament after nearly a year's delay. Although Britain did not need to join the single European currency or sign up to the treaty's social chapter, the timing was now all against him. The delay had allowed a head of steam against the Maastricht Bill to build up, fueled by the humiliation of Black Wednesday.
It was a great tragedy. If he'd stuck firm to the Maastricht Treaty, then he could have carried the day. I've got absolutely no doubt about that at all. He should have gone ahead, and he'd have got the majority support, and he would have been successful. I said so at the time, and I've always regretted since that he didn't beat it straight through.
For weeks upon weeks upon weeks, the thing lingered on the floor of the House of Commons with animated debates going on all sides, but including Conservatives debating against Conservatives on the floor of the House at enormous and ridiculous length.
A group of die-hard anti-European rebels formed within the Conservative Party. They called for a fresh start on Europe. The government's small majority gave them the opportunity to scupper the Maastricht Bill.
We became totally committed to what we were trying to do. We knew we had a chance because there were a lot of us. So we knew we had power. We had a mission. We felt strongly motivated. We felt that we were saving the country from a fate worse than being run from Brussels. And so we welded together like a group of SAS determined to fulfil our mission.
In the House of Lords, Margaret Thatcher and her lieutenant, Norman Tebbit, egged on the Conservative rebels.
There's far too much centralisation going on, far too much bureaucracy going on. We don't like it, but nevertheless we're going to ratify the Maastricht Treaty. These things just don't, to me, add up.
Norman Tebbit would be in the lobbies, encouraging people to vote against the government in a quite extraordinary way. And Margaret Thatcher sat in her room in the House of Lords, summoning new and often impressionable young backbenchers one by one, in order to explain to them that it was their duty to vote against the government that they had been elected to support.
One of our colleagues who went along to see her was told by her that, in fact, his backbone and brain were not connecting, or words to that effect, and he came away from that meeting so upset that he did cry. He was seen to be in tears.
Who hasn't she carried on a campaign against? Her life has been one series of campaigns against individuals, as I know full well. But he ought not to have given way to that. He should have fought it back. And lots of us would have come out of his support. And we'd have been quite happy to drive these other people way into the background. That was what was so sad about it all.
I did consider on a number of occasions directly responding in public and forcibly. I decided against it on balance for this reason. I was seeking to damp down divisions in the party. That would certainly have opened them up even further.
On the 4th of November 1992, the first crucial vote on the Maastricht Bill finally took place, a so-called paving motion. With so small a government majority, the future of the bill and the Prime Minister was in doubt. If the motion was rejected, the Prime Minister had warned that he would call a general election.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 316.
In the event, John Major won the paving motion by just 3 votes.
The House of Commons was in uproar, and I turned round to my own backbenchers, and 80% of them were waving order papers and cheering. But the other 20% weren't. They were sitting there in a great phalanx, many of them with their arms crossed, looking very grim-faced indeed, grim-faced and angry. And I knew then that there was going to be much more trouble than we had even imagined in the past in getting this bill through the House of Commons.
The poison of the European debate was present in the cabinet itself. There were constant leaks in the press and hostile briefings. The Prime Minister came to mistrust a number of his more Eurosceptic colleagues and was increasingly isolated in number 10.
He had this extraordinary stamina in office, but nonetheless, the abrasions of criticism, and not so much criticism as just infighting within the party, the feeling that you sit at a cabinet table with a group of people who are all out delivering their own political agenda somewhere else. By the time the meetings ended, wears people down, and it began to have quite an impact, I think, on his personality over time.
The Prime Minister became temperamental. He lacked a senior confidant with whom he could share his innermost thoughts. The departure of his friend Chris Patten to be governor of Hong Kong was seen by many as a blow, taking away both a wise counsellor and a sounding board who was never replaced.
Events did make him feel pretty lonely, and he didn't become easier to work with, I think, when he felt sort of put upon by life. He needed not only people who'd give him good advice, he needed one or two more people who'd say, you know, snap out of it, don't be daft.
I used to sometimes ring up on Sunday afternoon, encouraged by my friend Chris Patten, who was by then in Hong Kong, whose line was, you must ring him up, because just imagine who else is ringing him up if you don't. At least you're blocking the telephone from somebody else, which is not, of course, a good argument. But I did try and contribute, and also I'd been aware, having been the private secretary to a Prime Minister in the past, Mr. Heath, how lonely Prime Ministers get, and that it just helps to have people ringing out sometimes and just chatting.
It was after lunch one Sunday at Chequers, and I was leaving, I guess, getting into the car, and he came to say goodbye. And he said, oh dear, Robin, it's a bit of a struggle, isn't it? I suppose it's all right, or something like that. I said to him, come on, you needn't feel like that. You're well established. You needn't have this anxiety.
Since Black Wednesday, John Major had lost the support of the press. Traditionally, Tory newspapers turned against the Prime Minister and savaged him at every turn. The Daily Telegraph, a bastion of Middle England and upholder of conservative values, once an ally, became a sworn enemy.
Many of us, in whom I think I'd include myself, didn't look down on him because he came from Brixton or because he hadn't an education. We came to look down on him because one found it deeply depressing to see a man who'd fought all his way through political life and had aspired to the highest office in the land, and then spent all his time when he got there complaining about how bloody difficult it was. And I think that is a pathetic position for a leading politician to find himself in.
The constant press criticism from all points on the political spectrum would have hurt anybody, but the Prime Minister was particularly sensitive.
He grew almost obsessively anxious about it, almost traumatized by it, as I would have been, as anybody would have been in those circumstances, to the extent that I think he sometimes found it quite hard to think straight about it, so blinded was he by a sense of fury and injustice.
I saw him for about 2.5 hours every Monday morning without fail. And he'd often be grey, ashen. There was a spitting image character of John Major at the beginning, which was grey. And his pallor used to look like that after he had had the Sunday papers rammed down his throat.
I mean, that comes across very strongly in all their
From the beginning, officials at Number 10 had done their best to shield the Prime Minister.
Your safe haven's idea. Yesterday.
We all think outside politics that politicians have thick skins, but why should they?
A thin blue line.
He was incapable of not reading the newspapers. We used to say to the messengers at Number 10, who used to wait outside the cabinet room, when the Evening Standard would come in, if it had something nasty in it, we'd say, hide it away, put it in a drawer. But he could sniff it out. He always found it, even when we'd hidden it from him.
John Major wasn't the only one. Ever since Black Wednesday, Norman Lamont, his Chancellor, had been the object of a sustained campaign of vilification and ridicule.
Are you past your sell-by date?
Why don't you concentrate on some issues instead of asking silly questions? These stories damaged me in the eyes of everybody, the eyes of the Prime Minister, the eyes of the parliamentary party, and the eyes of the public. I mean, people often say they don't believe what they read in newspapers, but unfortunately what they read in the newspapers is the only thing they associate or know about somebody.
The government was still in an economic mess. The '92 election had been won on a policy of tax cutting, but public spending was running out of control. The Chancellor had no choice but to raise taxes. In the budget on the 16th of March 1993, Norman Lamont announced that he was putting VAT on fuel to raise an extra £7 billion. Although economically effective, the tax increase was another political disaster for John Major's government.
I think people did feel betrayed. I think Conservatives felt let down. When people first thought of Labour and Conservative, they thought Labour put taxes up, Conservatives do not, or Conservatives bring taxes down. So we were damaging not only what we'd said in the 1992 election, we were sort of damaging the long-term reputation of the Conservative Party. It was a serious matter.
We had to raise revenue in order to protect services. Raising revenue means raising taxes. If it wasn't value-added tax, where would it be? Income tax, some other undesirable area. There was no easy option. Sometimes in politics, you're caught between the bad and the awful.
The Conservative Party was wounded in its heartland. The Newbury by-election, 2 months after the budget, was an unwanted test of the government's popularity. Norman Lamont once again became the focus of attention at a press conference.
What do you regret most, saying that you sang in the bath on Black Wednesday, or promising green shoots of recovery?
Je ne regrette rien.
Rendell, David Digby, Liberal Democrat, 37,000.
It was another calamity, the worst by-election defeat since the Conservatives came to power in 1979.
What do you think of the election results last night?
Many blamed Norman Lamont and called for his scalp. The truth was that since Black Wednesday and the rumours about John Major's mental condition that grim day, relations between two of the most powerful men in the land had broken down. They spoke rarely, and then only on official matters. In public, the Prime Minister praised his Chancellor, but behind the scenes he agonised over his future. Norman Lamont himself refused to believe the speculation amongst colleagues and in the media that he was about to go, so soon after the Prime Minister had praised him openly and backed his budget.
We had the greatest difficulty in framing the 1993 budget. We knew it would be unpopular. I told the Prime Minister it would be unpopular. I couldn't believe that he would do that and then just a few weeks later do something that implied it had all been a tremendous error. That was what seemed to me rather difficult to believe.
Early in the morning on the 27th of May 1993, the Prime Minister summoned Norman Lamont to number 10. He told him that he wanted him to leave the Treasury and offered him the job of Environment Secretary.
He was very pale, almost monosyllabic, and he just said no, thank you, he didn't want the job, and then I pressed him to take the job, and he said no.
I said that I was very grateful to him for this offer, but that I had made up my mind, and I thought that if relations between us had come to this pass, it would be better for him, as well as for myself, if I left the government.
And then at the end of the meeting, he got up and he left, and we have not had a conversation since.
Mr. Lamont, anything to say?
He chose to leave. I suspect he regretted it, and I think that upset him very badly and was evident in the way he subsequently behaved.
Well, I was bitterly hurt, but I don't think it's very surprising. I've entirely recognized that I was someone who was severely damaged politically, but I felt throughout my time at the Treasury I had not been given very good backing from the Prime Minister, to be absolutely honest, and I felt that I had been his protector. I felt, in his phrase, he had frequently said to me that I was the lightning rod that deflected criticism from him. Many, many people said that. This is not an easy statement for me to make today, but I'm sure that the House will understand that, and I'm sure that
Norman Lamont exacted his revenge 2 weeks later.
To give up being Chancellor of the Exchequer...
His comments at the end of his speech did great damage to the government's standing and to the reputation of the Prime Minister.
There is too much short-termism, too much reacting to events, not enough shaping of events. We give the impression of being in office, but not in power.
Well, I think that was probably the best soundbite that Norman ever produced. If he'd produced soundbites like that when he'd been Chancellor, he'd been a good deal more effective in public presentation. If we were in office and not in power, it's astonishing how we managed to bring inflation down, astonishing how we managed to reform public services, astonishing how we managed to change education and much else besides.
It was a remark I made. It resonated, perhaps more than I'd intended, but it resonated because unfortunately people knew it was true.
While the Cabinet remained loyal to the Prime Minister in public, John Major suspected that several colleagues were denigrating his leadership, especially on Europe, through leaks and secret briefings behind his back. Right-wingers Michael Portillo, Peter Lilly and John Redwood, a new arrival in Cabinet, were the prime suspects.
I was extremely frustrated at the way a lot of people had behaved for a lot of time. We were all there to represent the interests of the government and represent the interests of the Conservative Party. Some of them, frankly, didn't seem to me to be doing that.
Lock the doors.
By the summer, many Conservative MPs outside the cabinet were in revolt. On the 22nd of July, an amendment to the Maastricht Treaty's social chapter, cunningly conceived by the opposition, led to the government's defeat by a hair's breadth as rebels and Labour teamed together.
The ayes to the right, 316. The noes to the left, 324.
I think it's fair to say that night of that vote, there was just a general view which I think people had that the party was beginning to fall apart. Because there were some people like myself who would do anything to stop the Maastricht Treaty. There were others who had got involved who they thought were anti-Majorites, you know, people who didn't like him. And I think it's fair to say that the state of unhappiness and discord in the party was probably greater that night than on any previous occasion.
John Major now declared that the issue was one of confidence in his government.
The sheer impact of what had happened when we had been defeated in the vote the night before, and the threat of a vote of confidence in a general election, had roused the Conservative Party in the country. Many of them were very frustrated. In fact, they were livid with many of the people who'd been voting against us. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, it was evident that as fast as their dignity would permit, many of them were clambering back on board.
Although John Major had got his bill at last, his troubles were not over. The day he won the confidence vote, off-the-cuff remarks after an interview were recorded and made public.
Occasionally, private frustrations burst out. I think it's inevitable if you are beset, as frankly the government was on every side at the time. Sometimes there has to be a private valve for that to come out, and sometimes that happened with me in private. I express my views somewhat pithily, rather saltily, you might think, occasionally in private. On this occasion, it wasn't as private as I had thought, and my words became public.
Okay. And where do you think most of this poison has come from? It's come from the dispossessed and the never-possessed. You and I can both think that ex-ministers are going around causing all sorts of trouble. Do you want 3 more of the bastards out there?
I was replying generically. I didn't actually specifically have 3 members in mind. I did have people in mind, but they weren't all in the cabinet. What was interesting was that the press immediately assumed who 3 cabinet members might be. The sheer frustration I felt at the difficulties we'd had within the government and from beyond the government in the party just burst out. And I just said exactly what I thought. I was tired, I was fed up, and frankly at that moment I didn't give a damn.
John Major's comments were a devastating revelation of his true feelings, that he felt he was in reality a strong leader, holding a divided and fractious party together by dint of sheer force of personality, that he was hamstrung by a tiny majority and by a constant harking back to a golden Thatcherite era that never was. Whether true or not, his comments further damaged his relations with the right and alienated many in his cabinet. The bitter civil war would continue.
And you can see the final part of the Major years at the same time next week on BBC One. An epic journey across Europe, Africa and America. Michael Palin's following in the footsteps of author Ernest Hemingway next. And John Major is being interviewed by Tim Sebastian tomorrow evening on BBC News 24 in Hard Talk at 10:30.
You mean? My father always had to point out.
New Taste Breaks Potato Gratin.